Considering what used to pass for a scary video game was Jason chasing you around a pixelated house, I'd say horror games have come quite a long way. Folks found a way to combine the anxiety of horror media with gaming's innate immersion to create some of the best gaming experiences of all time. But there's one horror gaming classic that all too often gets forgotten: Burger Tycoon, a game in which you play as a morally tormented monster. Part 1. The Basics. Burger Tycoon is an old Flash game business sim where you play as the CEO of a fast food company. You bounce between 4 areas of management: agricultural, feedlot, fast food restaurant floor, and corporate HQ. In the agricultural section, you're managing your main exports, soy and cows. Well, I guess you don't quite export the cows so much as you do their remain. In order to run a tight shift, you need to bring in enough soy to keep your cows fed, and you need to manage the soil fertility of the lots your cows live on. Cause them boys be pissing and shitting, let me tell ya. And it's not good for the soil. In the feedlot, your goal is to kill off the sick cows before they're turned into... Cows will randomly get sick, so you have to kill them off before they get fed to the grinder. While on the feedlot, you can add wastes or hormones to the soy. They make customers sick, but they immensely speed up operation. We'll get to that in a minute. The fast food section's all about crew morale. Each employee is either happy, calm, bored, or angry. The worse an employee feels, the more breaks they take, aka they work at a slower pace. To discipline them, you can give them an Employee of the Week badge or a stern talking to, each having a chance of improving their mood. Be careful though, you can only use each option once, and after that, their emotional state is permanent. Finally, we have corporate headquarters. You have a marketing team that makes ad campaigns. You have a PR office that keeps you in contact with persons of interest. And finally, you have a board of executives. They update you on budget reports and the company's status with activist groups. This is as good a time as any to mention that the actions you carry out have the potential to upset a variety of groups. Upset them enough and a warning message will pop up. They all essentially say, "You're gonna lose customers due to your actions, dumbass." Long story short, doing bad things has in-game consequences. On the surface, it looks like pretty basic Tycoon sim material, but Burger Tycoon has an approach and tone unique to the genre. It puts the political of its industry front and center. Imagine if Zoo Tycoon had a mechanic where you had to battle in the court of public opinion with PETA. That'd be weird, right? Might be cool, but weird nonetheless. Like, Zoo Tycoon isn't a game interested in questioning the morality of housing animals in captivity. It's just a fun, apolitical, relaxing game where you shove 30 orcas in a small pool. Burger Tycoon, on the other hand, is upfront with the seedy nature of your industry. It's baked into every aspect of the game. It's upfront with your impact on the climate. If we could avoid contributing to global warming, we would, but we can't do it if we want to keep our profits high. This, sadly, is often the reality. Plenty of companies don't disagree with the science of climate change, they just don't want to publicly acknowledge it, because if they did, the steps they'd have to take to lower their carbon output would drastically decrease profits. We see this in ExxonMobil, who is exposed for knowing about their impact on the climate for decades privately, while they pushed disinformation publicly. When introducing your restaurant crew, the game says, "For the most ungrateful, the best solution is firing. Eliminate the weak links." This speaks to the dehumanization minimum wage workers experience. By tying in-game productivity to an employee's emotional state, the game shows us how unconcerned businesses have to be with people, the individual employees that is, if they want to maximize profits. Their mental health is by its nature irrelevant. To the higher-ups, all that matters is productivity, whether you're strong or weak. And if the few avenues you have to meaningfully change their mental state don't work, you see how they immediately become a liability to the production model. and how it's more efficient to just get somebody who will be happy. In the game, your employees don't even get names, further cementing their place as just a cog in the machine. On top of that, the game takes the eventual disillusionment of your employees as a given, suggesting that these jobs, by their nature, become a depressing burden on their workers. The game describes these forest plots as a millennia-old rainforest, forcing the player to realize that the continued expansion of their operation requires the destruction of old, precious wildlife. Also, if you bribe the nearby mayor and use the land meant for his citizens' crops, a blurb tells you that the town's resources are exhausted and that its citizens are starving, making you reflect on the impact of these global companies on the livelihoods of indigenous or local peoples. Lastly, the game shows you how corporate decision-makers numb themselves to the impact of their actions. It pens some doublethink so tight I'm sure it was crafted in a ghoulish conservative think tank. Like this blurb, which justifies bribing the mayor to use the city's land. With a small sum of money, we can obtain permission to use common lands and bring richness to this corner of the world. Note the contradiction that the bribe is both a small sum of money to persuade the business person into believing it's a minor sale not worth deliberating the morality of, but that giving a supposedly small amount of money to the mayor will somehow also bring richness to the area. If it truly brings richness, it wouldn't be a small sum of money given to one individual. And if it truly is a small sum of money, it wouldn't bring richness. My point here isn't to tease apart which of these two possibilities is more accurate to the situation, but rather to illuminate how this kind of language, which feels ripped from how a lot of business people talk in real life, is used by people in power to justify their occupation. That taking the land of these natives is somehow ultimately good for the masses because it puts a little bit of money in a few people's pockets, when in reality, as the game shows, it usually hurts the locals. We also see some keen corporate copium in the description of the village. The natives are described as wild, despite the fact that they've built some damn fine-looking houses over here. That's because it's necessary for the mind of the business person to view them as lesser, uncivilized, unevolved even. Otherwise, they might get second thoughts about leveling this village for the sake of profits. Now you might be thinking, well, gee, Piley, all this corporate shit is kinda gross, but you said this was a horror game. What's scary about this? A fair question. Glad I thought of it. The horror of Burger Tycoon is not the awful things it reminds you exist, but the way the game forces you to engage in some of the most cruel, dehumanizing practices of our time. How exactly does it force you to engage in them, you might ask? Well, you are running a business, and as the game puts it, in love and war, everything's illicit. Part 2. Market and Mechanic Incentives. The game lets you do some really shitty stuff. You can add waste or hormones to the soy to fatten up the cows and speed up production. You can bulldoze rainforests and the land of native tribes, and you can fire your employees at will. But none of that's required, right? Surely you can play as a nice guy. While you aren't forced to do anything bad, the game has a bunch of mechanics that push you in those directions. Let's look at a few. You start with 8 plots of land. To balance out soy and cow production, a basic operation would be 2 or 3 cow plots and 4 or 5 soy fields, which runs smoothly at first. Problem is, again, leaving cows on a space for too long ruins the soil, and dirty spaces lead to sicker cows and a higher chance of obesity in clients. So keeping the soil healthy is a priority. Plus, if a space hits 0% fertility, it's unusable for the rest of the game. With the need to cycle through land, you'll eventually run out of room. You'll need a space to put a soy field and find yourself left only with a field of piss. But expanding outward makes soil management a breeze. And here's the shocker. Leveling the forests or the village is actually cheaper than the spaces you're given. I assume this was made up, but it seems that because of deregulation, at various points in history, Deforestation is cheaper than buying somebody else's already cultivated land, meaning that it's been within the financial, profitable interests of various corporations to level the Amazon rainforests rather than buy from old Farmer Joe. By giving you real-life market incentives for endless expansion, it's almost like the game is putting you in the shoes of someone who makes these kinda destructive choices every single time. Like land expansion, hormones make the maturation process of cows super easy. But make no mistake, the game points out how harmful their application can be. Soon after using hormones, you start to get protested by obesity awareness groups. And if you use fodder, you get protests from consumer health groups. And you know what's the scary part? All it takes to mitigate these protests is an ad campaign. You don't have to change anything to get those customers back, you just have to find a way to convince different customers to eat at your restaurant. Which makes sense. Since there are millions of potential customers out there, corporations don't care who's buying the burgers, so long as enough people are. And the bad PR never impacts your work pool, seeing as there are always people in need of a job, no matter how bad your business's reputation is. They don't stop the lawsuits you'll get, but don't worry, to be rid of lawsuits, you just need to buy out people of interest. At which point, rarely do any lawsuits stick, and even if some do, they're tiny fines, like a few $1,000s tops. Once you've got enough money from your profiteering, you're immediately able to shield yourself from accountability from any of the consequences that might ordinarily come from said profiteering. It's almost like the game is pointing out that once you've gained control of a large enough share of the market, you become like an undead, lumbering monster who can't be stopped. But you can, after hearing all these examples of shitty things you can do, reaffirm the fact that nothing in the game is forcing you to do any of this. You can, after all, just use your starting 8 spaces of land, never intruding on the locals, never using any additives that would hurt your customers, and run a small mom-and-pop operation that values its employees and only uses honest marketing. But you'll eventually hit a wall. After a few years, you'll find yourself in a hole, unable to produce enough on your measly 8 plots of land to ever have a full restaurant. And that should be fine, right? We should be able to feel grateful for our limited operation and not feel tempted to cause harm en route to expanding our business. Right? Well, you see, there's a tiny, nagging voice in the back of every business person's mind, like a vindictive devil on their shoulder, that drives them to such harmful choices, and Burger Tycoon shines a light on this exact destructive influence. Part 3. The true horror of Burger Tycoon. It's the profit motive, alright? It's the fucking profit motive. A game mechanic I've yet to touch on are these little people that alert you when things go awry. They jump up and down screaming and a light blinks on your screen. They'll say things like increase soy production or hire more grillmen. And they don't stop pestering you until you do what they say. This is most pronounced with the board of directors. They have one message: growth is not sufficient. That's it. They don't specify too much spent on ads or anything like that. They just say, growth is not sufficient. Which sounds unhelpful, but in reality it makes sense. Why would shareholders care how you make sufficient growth, so long as you make it happen? But eventually they're satisfied, yeah? Once you make enough money, they leave you alone, right? Well, no, actually, they never really stop pestering you. Even if you've been on a decades-long profit climb, the second you go from making a lot of money to only a little bit of money, they'll be on your ass to demand you do something to increase this quarter's profits. And you might say to yourself, okay, fine, so the game pressures you to make money. But that's just until you hit the winning end state, right? Well, I haven't touched on this yet, but the game doesn't have a goal or an endpoint. It's not a race to a dollar amount, there's no competition. You just press play and things start happening. Not only that, the game is endless. So, in a never-ending game whose only aspect that even half resembles a goal is maximizing profits, the message that drives you forward ends up being growth is not sufficient. and that message could, theoretically, drive you forward for an eternity. Now, some viewers might take issue with these bits. They'd probably say something like, of course the corporation would do awful shit if it had no competitors. If the game really wants to critique reality, it'd have you competing against other companies. And believe it or not, I too wish the game had competition, but not for the reasons this theoretical critic wants them. I think gamifying competition would lead players to see that the awful choices we've been discussing so far are actually incentivized by competition, not de-incentivized. If you're trying to be ethical in your business model, but your competitors are leveling forests and beating you in quarterly profits, the profit motive would inevitably lead you to one of many unethical choices to catch up, as it does in real life. Or maybe your competition has a strong ethical business model, but you see an avenue to get a leg up on them, and so you take an unethical route to get up in quarterly profits. So I actually think the presence of competition would strengthen the themes of the game, not ruin them. I also imagine said potential critics would view the lack of an ending as an unrealistic flaw. But to those naysayers, I'll ask a simple question. At what point would McDonald's stop? How much would Amazon need to make for them to call it quits? To complain about the game not having an endpoint presupposes that real-life companies have end goals in mind. So let's ask, do companies ever stop growing? Is growth ever sufficient for a corporation? As a case study, let's look at Disney. Dominating 2D and 3D animation wasn't enough, so they bought the largest sports channel in the US as well as several cable stations. Then cable networks weren't enough, so they bought the most popular superhero universe. And then Marvel wasn't enough, so they bought the most popular sci-fi franchise. And then Star Wars wasn't enough, so then they bought 50 years of a studio's IP when Fox was selling. And I see no reason to assume Disney has any intention of stopping here. For what's even really the point of accumulating capital, if not to leverage it for deals in your favor to make even more capital? It's a process with no intended end in sight. As Burger Tycoon so aptly puts it, for many large corporations, it seems growth is never sufficient. And again, what's truly scary here isn't that the game reminds you big ol' mean companies exist or that corporations take harmful shortcuts, but that the game puts you in the driver's seat and says, you're managing a company. The green line needs to go up really fast. Make it happen. And through this immersion, Burger Tycoon reveals that when you're in a position that requires you to maximize profits, you are at times forced to go with the most harmful options. Try to run a small, non-invasive, not factory farm? Stall out a few years down the line when operating costs get too high. Want to just grill your burgers without dipping your toes into corruption? You'll get hit with bad PR, lawsuits, and eventually go bankrupt. Try to be nice to your employees? They'll eventually get depressed and slow you down, so you need to kick them to the curb. With the sole goal of making shareholders happy, the moral choices eventually can no longer coincide with your business model. No matter how much you might be repulsed by these harmful choices, the game makes you realize they become unavoidable in a profit-based market system. By putting you in charge of a megacorporation, bluntly exposing you to the impact of your choices, and giving you real-world market incentives for leveling rainforests or pumping cows full of dangerous hormones, Burger Tycoon exposes the harmful choices our modern world engages in on a daily basis for the sake of appeasing the profit gods. Destruction of the rainforest, political corruption, factory farming, alienating workers, harmful hormones, usurping the land of native peoples, all destructive choices that we've normalized because they make operating costs slightly cheaper. The terror of Burger Tycoon isn't that it merely shows you these horrific choices and then says, if only we had the right people managing the system, this sure wouldn't happen. The actual horror of Burger Tycoon is that it shows you all the destruction and pain caused by these corporations and reveals to us the system is working exactly as intended. Part 4. Conclusion. While other genres of art convey brutality through a passive view of events, Burger Tycoon makes you interact with destructive, dehumanizing acts, and it requires you to become numb to their moral weight. You have to get used to firing folks on a whim. You have to accept that your products, by their very nature, increase obesity. You have to become the puppet master behind a corporate machine that causes abject destruction to the environment and the third world. The scariest video game isn't the one with the most zombies or jump scares. It's the one that ensnares its players in the driver's seat of a cyclical, destructive corporate model that demands profit at the expense of our fellow man. And that very game is Burger Tycoon. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone. Special shout out to all my definitely not monstrous patrons, like those whose names are currently on screen. On top of generously supporting me, patrons get access to exclusive and early content, like rough edits of every video and unreleased behind-the-scenes footage. So be sure to join me on Patreon if you want access to all those goodies. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to toss me one of them likes and subscribe down below. Click the little bell and set the notifications to all so you can know the exact nanosecond I release my next video. Make sure to share this video on whichever social medias you frequent. It really helps the channel out and I greatly appreciate it. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter because, I don't know, f you, that's why. Thanks much, and I'll see you next time.